Good evening. I'm Priya Ratnam, the director of the Shrewsbury Public Library. First, I would like to thank Dr. Benjamin Horgan for graciously letting us use this beautiful space to host the Shrewsbury Public Library Foundation's Distinguished Speaker Series. Today, we are happy to welcome Dr. Russell Johnson as our distinguished speaker. Dr. Johnson is a Shrewsbury native and a St. John's alum, and his favorite subject in school was history. Dr. Johnson teaches religious studies at the University of Chicago. He studies the philosophy of communication and Christian ethics with a specific focus on disagreement, antagonism, and how groups imagine and treat their enemies. His book, Beyond Civility in Social Conflict, Dialogue, Critique, and Religious Ethics, is about the ethics of communication and how to challenge people's views in a compassionate and disruptive way. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Luis Garron, who's a scientist who worked in the biopharmaceutical discovery and development, and also a lifelong amateur musician. She serves on the Shrewsbury Public Library Foundation and will facilitate the Q&A part of today's presentation. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Priya. Before I begin, I would like to say a word of gratitude to the Shrewsbury Public Library and everyone involved in making this event possible. Growing up not far from here in Shrewsbury, I spent countless hours in that library, and I'm grateful to the library for fostering my lifelong love of books. Though at the time, most of the books I was reading were about kids who could morph into animals. A little different. It's an honor to be invited to speak here with you today, and an honor to see my book only a few shelves away from those Animorphs books. It is also an honor to be speaking here at my alma mater, St. John's High School, where I graduated from 20 years ago, and my thanks go out to the people who are hosting us this evening. Among St. John's alumni, I hold the rare distinction of having had both a plaque in the lobby with my name in it and a rule in the rule book that would not have existed were it not for the particular brand of mischief that I got up to in my time here. A lot of people have one or the other, not many have both. My research is on the question of how we can talk to people we disagree with, communicating across lines of moral, political, and religious difference. This means that I'm one of those scholars whose work is relevant, but I wish it weren't. When I tell people what I work on, they usually say something like, "Well, that's really important these days," and then we both get sad for a moment. I envy some of my colleagues at the university who research questions like, what were Vikings' shoes made out of? And can jellyfish solve a Rubik's Cube? Leather and no. My book, as Priya mentioned, came out a few months ago, and it is titled Beyond Civility in Social Conflict, Dialogue, Critique, and Religious Ethics. It came out recently, but I started working on this book back in 2015, and it has only become more urgent and timely since then, a fact which my publisher was gracious enough to remind me a few times. The roots of this project, however, go back even further, to my time in college. I was attending a secular liberal university during the school year and working at a conservative Christian camp during the summers. I felt at home in both communities, and I knew and respected many sincere, thoughtful people in both. But these communities often saw themselves as on opposite sides of a culture war, and I found myself playing translator, saying things like, well, they don't really believe that, or yeah, but you have to understand that belief in this context, and so on. From that experience, I got interested in the question of where these disagreements come from, and it's why it's so difficult to understand people who see the world differently from you. Also, I am a Christian, and Jesus called us to love our enemies. What does it look like to love your enemy when they are supporting leaders and policies that hurt millions? Is it possible to love someone and still confront them? And if so, what does it mean to confront someone in a loving way? These are the questions that motivate me, the questions that, as they say, get me out of bed in the morning. Well, those questions and Dunkin' Donuts coffee, of course. In our time together tonight, I'll share a bit about how I tried to address these questions in the book, offer hopefully a few practical suggestions, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. We live in polarized times. As many political scientists and pundits have noted, polarization can be a threat to the healthy functioning of democracy. Democracy depends on cooperation, on convincing one another, and sometimes on compromise. And all of these are endangered when people do not have respect for their political opponents. To address this pressing problem, people across the political spectrum have argued that we need more civility and dialogue, that we need to lower the temperature, find common ground, and replace hostility with compassion. We also live in unjust times. Wars, the denial of human rights to marginalized groups, and a growing ecological catastrophe threaten our present and loom over our future. What Martin Luther King Jr. called the three evils of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation remain prevalent, and prophetic voices like Dr. King's remain necessary. To address this pressing problem, people across the political spectrum have argued that we need vehement protest and dramatic action. This is not a time to be polite. This is a time to say no in the strongest possible terms. How do we reconcile these two demands? We have an ethical obligation to treat people as we wish to be treated, to listen to what they say and let it challenge our preconceptions, and to find ways to work with them rather than simply working against them. But we also have an ethical obligation to make laws that protect the weak, to uphold the rights and freedoms of all people, and to tell the truth even when it makes others angry. How do we choose between these two obligations? In the words of the Hebrew prophet Micah, do we do justly or do we love mercy? There's no easy answer, but thankfully we can learn from others who have faced this dilemma in the past. I think we can get some help from the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was a pivotal leader in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Archbishop Tutu, as you may know, spoke here at St. John's back in 2011. He was also the graduation speaker at my college, the University of North Carolina, the year that I graduated, which was very special. Duke had gotten Oprah to be their graduation speaker, and obviously we had to do better than Duke, so we got Archbishop Desmond Tutu. How many Nobel Peace Prizes did Oprah win? 0. Desmond Tutu got one. It's fine. I'm over it. We may now think of Desmond Tutu as the smiling, wise elder who goes on Sesame Street and talks about peace and joy. So it's easy to forget that in the 1980s, Tutu was a firebrand and a radical. Nelson Mandela described him as, quote, the most hated man among white South Africans, in part because he was one of the most respected and admired leaders among black South Africans. Tutu insisted that the apartheid social order, in which white South Africans had rights that were denied to black South Africans, was immoral and unchristian. He called for boycotts and sanctions against his own country in order to put pressure on leaders to change these policies. In July 1985, anti-apartheid protests in South Africa reached a fever pitch, to the point where a small number of black protesters were killing people they suspected of collaborating with the police. Archbishop Tutu made a series of statements in which he argued that this violence was counterproductive. According to Tutu, since those in power justified apartheid by appealing to the stereotype that black South Africans were incapable of self-governance, Anytime black protesters resorted to violence or looting, they unwittingly lent credence to the very ideology they were trying to overthrow. Though these actions were motivated by anti-apartheid sentiment, they ironically played into the hands of the oppressive apartheid order. Tutu said, quote, "By fighting and engaging in violent acts, we give others the excuse to say we are not yet ready to govern ourselves," end quote. Speaking to his fellow anti-apartheid South Africans, Tutu said, quoting again, "We have a cause that is just. We have a cause that is going to prevail. For goodness sake, let us not spoil it by the kind of methods that we use." Tutu's argument is fascinating. He's combining moral and strategic reasoning at the same time, and I'd like to dwell on that for a moment. A person or group's actions send a message. Our deeds communicate something just as much as our words do. What Tutu is arguing is that in the context of South Africa at the time, for the oppressed black majority to use violence would be conveying a message to those in power that black people are dangerous and need to be ruled and suppressed by apartheid leaders. For Tutu, the anti-apartheid movement has to pay attention to how its words and actions will be interpreted by those in a position to make things better, including leaders, foreign onlookers, and the protesters themselves. Part of the problem with anti-apartheid violence was that it sent a message that clashed with the overarching message of the movement. The movement is trying to say, we are ready for democracy and we deserve democracy, while the violence done in the name of the movement, according to Tutu, ironically communicated, we are not ready for democracy and we don't deserve it. That's what I find interesting about Tutu's argument. He's not saying we need to fight with one hand tied behind our back. We need to refrain from using violence, even though violence could be a more effective method of gaining freedom. He could have said that, but he didn't. What he said instead is that by refusing to use violence, the anti-apartheid movement could be even more effective in challenging the injustice of apartheid. By demonstrating with your words and actions that you are a human being, that you have dignity, that you are capable of cooperation and discipline and self-government, you not only strike at the political power of the apartheid leaders, you strike at the stereotypes and illusions that sustain the apartheid mindset. Nonviolent action was more disruptive because it didn't just disrupt the oppressive social order, it also disrupted all of the ideas that rationalized it. The more I read about the history of nonviolent direct action, the more I kept encountering this same sort of reasoning again and again. People like Mohandas Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Adolfo Perez Esquivel, and Lema Gabawi all opted for nonviolent protest because they thought it would be more effective than violent protest. Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "I believe that for practical as well as moral reasons, nonviolence offers the only road to freedom for my people," end quote. Practical as well as moral. Nonviolence is not just a pure way of acting, untainted by the sins of hatred or killing. It is often an effective method for bringing about political and social change. Why is this the case? Well, in the book, I turn to the work of activist and poet Barbara Deming to think through this. Though she's not well known today, Deming was a key figure in the American anti-war movement in the 1960s and 1970s, as well as protest movements for racial and gender justice. Deming argued that nonviolent protest works best when there's a combination of resistance and respect. The particular strength of nonviolence is that it puts two pressures on the opponent, pressures which Deming argues are particularly effective in combination. The first pressure is the pressure of resistance to injustice, of refusal to cooperate in an unjust system, and refusal to silently acquiesce to the status quo. The second pressure is respect, human concern for all people, including the opponents, that is, those who are directly or indirectly responsible for the injustice. If we rely exclusively on respect and not resistance, it can feed the illusion that everything is well and good, and that injustice can continue without interference. If we rely exclusively on resistance and not on respect, it can make everyone go into us versus them mode and make the opponent feel like they need to use force in order to defend themselves and maintain order. But by using both together, resistance and respect, we can make it harder for them to either ignore the problem or to justify reacting with violent oppression. And again, this applies not just to opponents, but also to onlookers who have the power to intervene one way or another. For Deming, nonviolent protests are effective because they convey two messages at the same time. On the one hand, protesters are saying, this is wrong. This cannot continue, and we're not going to remain silent about it. We care enough about it that we're willing to inconvenience ourselves, maybe even risk our safety, to get people to recognize the truth. On the other hand, protesters are saying, every person has dignity and rights. Another way is possible. We can work together to make things better. We care enough about you to change your mind. We aren't trying to humiliate or hurt anyone. We're trying to make everyone realize that change needs to happen and can happen. By conveying these two messages simultaneously, the nonviolent protester works to prevent people from reacting automatically and defensively, while also working to prevent people from carrying on as if everything is okay. Rather than conveying two different messages that work against one another, like pushing down on two sides of a seesaw at once, as we saw in Tutu's case against violence, the nonviolent protester conveys two different messages that work together to help people focus on real problems, to recognize the humanity of all involved, and to create an atmosphere where we can seek truth together rather than trying to win at all costs. With all of this in mind, what does this mean for communication in polarized societies? How should we talk in our interpersonal conversations, in writing, and on social media? I'm hesitant to give clear, practical advice for three reasons. First, I teach at the University of Chicago, whose unofficial motto is, that's all right in practice, but how does it work in theory? Why would I give people useful advice when I can talk for hours about a 19th century Danish philosopher they've never heard of? Second, if I give you all practical advice, you'll have no reason to buy the book. Or borrow it from your local library. It's all the same to me. I make like 7 cents every copy that gets sold. If I were in this business to make money, I would have written a new Animorphs book. It's been 24 years. I think we deserve more. The third reason why I'm hesitant is that there is no silver bullet solution. I can't make any promises that if you just speak well enough or write well enough, you'll be able to convince anyone. As Aristotle pointed out many years ago, rhetoric is like medicine. There are some patients who, no matter how good of a treatment you give them, their condition is going to get worse. Even if a doctor does everything right, the patient might die. Likewise, there are some people who, even if you perfectly craft a message that shakes the foundations of their worldview while inviting them to seek truth and justice with you, they aren't going to change their minds. That being said, just as there are a difference between a better treatment and worse treatment, I still think there are better ways that we can communicate, and I have some insights into how that can happen. First, try to solve problems together instead of trying to win. The goal is to get everyone involved to recognize the truth. One of the problems of polarization is that the logic of us versus them can do our thinking for us. And we become more motivated to justify ourselves and to defend our group than to figure out what's actually going on and how we need to act. As Barbara Deming said, the goal is to get people to think, to shake them out of their complacency, and also to avoid making them feel attacked, in which they reach for the nearest, well, what about, or insult, or some other dismissal. As you try to challenge someone's viewpoint, and again, I think that is something we need to do, try not to make it sound like they are the problem. Reiterate that there is a problem and that you think something can be done about it, and you'd like them to join you in figuring out what can be done about it. Nobody responds well to arguments like, why don't you stop being your kind of person and start being my kind of person? But by asking people, hey, here's an important problem, what do you think can be done to address it? This can encourage them to get beyond the thoughtless repetition of slogans that so often characterizes our political life. You might also discover that something you hadn't thought about before. At its best, disagreement can be an occasion for people to point out one another's blind spots and discover a way of going on that addresses the deepest concerns motivating everyone involved. That is to say, I don't study disagreement because I don't like disagreement. I study disagreement because good disagreement, constructive disagreement, is one of the most important and necessary things in this world. And the problem with polarization isn't that we have too much disagreement, it's that we have the wrong kind of disagreement, or that we're so tired of the other side that we don't even bother to disagree with them anymore. Second, break people's brains. Not literally, we're still being nonviolent. What I mean is that the most effective nonviolent protest didn't just hold up the smooth functioning of the unjust status quo. It also exposed some of the lies and misconceptions that people believed. By being disciplined and humane, Archbishop Tutu and the anti-apartheid movement made it harder for people to believe that Black South Africans had to be kept in line by force. By being persistent and non-compliant, Dr. King and the civil rights movement made it harder for people to believe that Black Americans were happy under segregation. By preaching sermons that called out human rights violations, St. Oscar Romero made it harder for people to believe that all the critics of the El Salvadoran government were godless communists. Polarization makes us think that there are only two kinds of people, and it's easy to rely on narrow, stereotypical views of our opponents. By communicating in ways that don't fit people's expectations, we open their minds to new possibilities. For example, many conservatives are skeptical about liberal economic proposals because they think liberals want a bigger government to solve all of their problems, and that they haven't learned the lesson of the Soviet-style communism that it does not work. When a liberal, therefore, talks about the importance of helping the poor and marginalized, this often only confirms the image in the minds of conservatives that liberals are bleeding heart idealists who never took Econ 101. If the liberal, however, explicitly mentions how they are also worried about totalitarian communism, or if they explain how their proposal will actually save taxpayers' money, now some of the customary reactions, our usual defenses, are down. The go-to moves don't seem to apply here. And conservatives might be more open-minded and willing to get into the problem-solving mindset. The same sort of reasoning could apply for conservative-leaning people trying to challenge the preconception that all pro-life people are religious theocrats. Good argumentation isn't about hitting the same points again and again with increasing force, but finding ways to disarm the attitudes that keep us locked in mutual misunderstanding. Third, don't forget to talk about how things should be and how things can be. I've been talking about political problems, but problems are, of course, only part of the story. Polarized political communication tends to turn into a game where people pile grievances upon grievances, with partisans finding flaws in their opponent and in the world, and others respond with, oh yeah, but what about this? And so on, back and forth, until we all shut our laptops in self-righteous frustration. Polarization thrives on outrage. A constant flow of outrage leads to cynicism, and cynicism creates the conditions for tyranny. Political consultant Anat Shenker-Osorio suggests instead that we do what she calls painting the beautiful tomorrow. People can't simply be made aware of the bad things that are happening, the freedoms that are being violated, the jobs that are being lost, but must also find an alternative toward which they can strive. She says, quote, Martin Luther King did not get famous for saying, I have a complaint. He certainly did not get famous for saying, I have a multi-bulleted list of policy proposals. There has to be a dream, end quote. Complaints are important, of course, but if we keep complaining, it can feed into the suspicion that the problems we face are natural and inevitable. Unless our political communication is creative and constructive as well as critical, it runs the risk of having a sedative effect, feeding into the suspicion that the way things currently are is the way they have to be. Ironically, the more we insist that things are bad and that they need to change, the more we can make people resigned to the way things are. By framing our communication in terms of how we want the world to be and what we can do to get there, we can draw people out rather than shutting them down. The greatest enemies of a good society are fear and a lack of imagination. People defend a political policy not because they love it, but because they have a hard time envisioning an alternative. They are afraid that if we change our course, we'll lose everything we hold dear. Some of the most powerful political communication addresses people's fears and helps them picture a better tomorrow. Fourth and finally, whenever you're disagreeing with someone, try to embody your values. This may seem obvious, of course, but it's easy for us to fight for our values in ways that ironically betray those values. As I discuss in the final chapter of the book, the central message of Christianity is a rejection of us versus them ways of thinking, replacing it with an affirmation that God loves every person, us and them, and that we find our deepest satisfaction when we take the risk of caring for others, even our enemies. And yet, the history of Christianity has many, many examples where people are willing to conquer, colonize, and kill in the name of Jesus. I'm not arguing that we should find and abide by a set list of rules of civility or that everyone involved can agree on. Rather, I argue that we should all do the difficult work of making sure that the way we fight for what we care for expresses the world we want to live in. Part of the power of nonviolent protest is that it helps people imagine a different way of interacting. By living as if every person had dignity, by living as if we can work together, by living as if finding the truth is more important than being right, we can start to bring that world into existence. Thank you.
He's a tough act to follow. Well, Dr. Johnson, thank you very much for the book and for the talk. But in your book, you talk about 3 voices in communication ethics. I might get the terms wrong, but I think one is civility, which to me means people who basically hate one another, sitting across from one another with fake smiles. And then there's winning.
Yes.
Right? And then there's another one that's kind of moral equivalence.
Civility, victory, and open-mindedness.
Open-mindedness, where open-mindedness I kind of put as moral equivalence. Can you elaborate on these a little bit?
I'd love to. Thank you, Louise. Yes, so there are, I think, when people talk about the ethics of communication across lines of difference, I think there are 3 main camps that all of these voices fall into. And it's not the case that every person fits into just one camp or the other. As a matter of fact, I think we switch between 3 competing logics. So the first logic is civility, which is to say there are a set of rules that we should all abide by, and we can disagree within those set of rules, but we can't disagree about those set of rules. And they work sort of like the rules of just war theory. Like, we're going to have a fight, but we're going to do it the right way. And then there's victory, which is to say the idea that the ends justify the means, and that the cause that we're arguing for is so important that we need to be able to make use of whatever tactics, even if we find them distasteful, whether that's dismissal, indoctrination, silencing, deception, etc. It's worth it for the cause that we're pursuing. And then there's open-mindedness, which takes the idea that trying to persuade another person is inherently an act of violence. You're doing something wrong by trying to change them. What we should do instead is have this sort of open dialogue where we simply try to understand rather than trying to critique or trying to persuade. And I argue that I give examples to these different approaches, and each of them has some good reasons that could be given for it, but I think each of them falls short as being a communication ethic that applies across all situations. Part of the problem with civility is that it means that whoever's making the rules of civility also kind of gets to determine who wins. And some of the movements that we take to be the most inspiring, civil rights movement, for instance, were deemed uncivil by the rules of the time. Civility, trying to enforce rules of civility often favors the status quo at the expense of anyone who's willing to call it into question. I mean, a good example is it's generally a good idea not to call your political opponents a fascist. But what if they are a fascist? So rules of civility can kind of, they have the effect of restraining communication, but also, ironically, sometimes it's the people who are most insistent on the rules of civility who are willing to break them, sometimes in the name of defending civility. I could give examples if we want to get into it. Victory has its own moral problems, of course, because I think then we're, again, treating people as means rather than as ends. And so I think it can lead to when both sides adopt the logic of we need to do everything we can do in order to win, that leads to a spiraling destructive conflict that ends up serving neither side in the long run, even if one side, quote unquote, wins. And then open-mindedness, I think, it has its problems, but one of them is it fails by its own standard. They're trying to persuade people not to be persuasive. And I think I agree with the great James Baldwin, which is, if I love you, I have to show you things that you do not see. Like, I think part of being compassionate to someone is not just refraining from telling them what's wrong, but helping them to see the world in a better way, and that can sometimes be confrontational.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to pose a question? We have some runners with handheld mics willing to come to you. Gentleman here, please. White hat.
Thank you. What happens if someone rejects facts? An example would be someone who thinks that the earth is flat, and if you've observed YouTube, there are many websites that try and justify the flatness of earth. How do you discuss or argue with someone like that?
That's a great question. There's no silver bullet. So there's not you just do this and it'll work. But I think one thing that happens is our beliefs are held in place by our other beliefs. And not just beliefs, but also by our fears, our hopes, our dreams, the connections, the people we feel connected to, the communities that we feel a part of. And so if you want to change someone's belief, it's often not enough to hit it with contrary facts. You have to discern, sort of like in a stone in an archway, each stone is held in place by all of the other stones that support it. And so you have to figure out, what is this belief doing for them? What function is it serving in their worldview to help them to see the world differently? And often when it comes to conspiracy beliefs like that, they've done a bunch of studies on this, and conspiracy beliefs take root when people feel like things are happening that they can't make sense of. And so having a belief in a conspiracy theory or a flat earth theory or something like that, it's correlated not so much with being uneducated or misinformed as much as it's correlated with feeling a sense of threat, feeling fear. And so some of the best treatments for helping people let go of the conspiracy beliefs that deep down inside they kind of know there's something ludicrous about them, is to help them be in a position where they don't feel like they need to have that I know something that other people don't know, I know what's really going on, that provides them with a rather sort of like you can eat rice for a long time, but it won't actually nourish you. I think you can live on conspiracy theories for a long time, but it doesn't actually provide you with a sustainable confidence. And so that's got to be part of any solution to address something like that.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Do we have another audience questioner? I'm sorry. Oh, yes, right there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm a senior at St. John's. I'm also part of the Independent Socialist group in Worcester. I was wondering, both of your examples were where the oppressed were kind of the majority in a sense. I know in America they weren't the majority, but there was enough that it was a strong presence, especially with white people helping out. What can we do when the oppressed isn't the majority, but they are really the minority within society?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, I think a lot of, so in any, as I meant, I'll expand on this a bit. I mean, in any situation, there's the people in positions of power who have power as we typically think about it. And then there's the people who are directly affected by acts of injustice. And then there's a lot of other people. We can call them onlookers. We can call them bystanders. In Tutu's case, for instance, there were the South African government. There were the Black South Africans, and then there were every other country, for instance. And so a lot of nonviolent protest is about leveraging power dynamics to where it doesn't become a numbers game of who has or by a game of might versus right, but it becomes a game in which we can pay attention where the truth lies. And so in an instance like that, it's not so much. I mean, it's not so much about using the minority to now demonstrate that it has greater power than the majority, as much as it is about shifting the conversation, or if there's no conversation going on, beginning a conversation and keeping the focus on what's true rather than who has the guns, who has the responsibilities, or rather the political power, that sort of thing. And so I think in situations where we see that happening, it's a way to, the biggest part of it is drawing attention to the fact that there are a lot of people whose voices are not being heard. You've probably heard the idea of like being a voice for the voiceless. And I think in situations like that, when there's a minoritized group who's oppressed, a big part of the nonviolent direct action is other people making sure that their concerns don't just get swept under the rug because they're a numerical minority.
Sorry. Another question?
There's some up there.
Yeah, right here. In the blue jacket, blue.
We got some up there too.
Oh, you got him? You're seeing him better than I am.
How do you address the human nature of confirmational bias and to overcome the inertia associated with the absence and willingness to put a little effort into open-mindedness?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. So confirmation bias, as you may be aware, is a cognitive bias in which we don't look for information just to figure out what's true. We look for information that supports what we already think to be the case. I find an illustration from the author Julia Galef particularly useful. She talks about the difference between the scout mindset and the soldier mindset. So, and what she says is most people, maybe not everybody, but most people are capable of being in both mindsets at different times in their life. So in the scout mindset, we're acting like a scout. We're trying to figure out what the lay of the land is, what's actually there. We're trying to explore and understand. Whereas in the soldier mindset, that's where we're in the sort of us versus them framework, to where our primary motivation is to defend our side from being humiliated or to defend ourselves. And that aligns pretty closely with confirmation bias. So a lot of what she's arguing in her book on the scout mindset is how do we, as much as possible, and of course it doesn't depend entirely on us because it takes two people to create a conversational atmosphere that encourages everyone involved to be in that scout mindset rather than in the soldier mindset. And a lot of that involves not trying to activate the identities, I'll explain what I mean in a second, that get people to think in those us versus them ways. There's a theory called social identity theory that was developed in the 1970s by Tajfel and Turner and others, and it is that whenever we're part of a group and we identify ourselves with a group, then that creates an opportunity for our desire to see our group victorious and praised and celebrated, and to want the groups that we take to be our opponents to be humiliated. And it can take a wafer-thin amount of identification in order for you to all of a sudden want your group to be the good ones. You may have heard of some of these studies, where they put boys and the rattlers versus the eagles, and there was nothing different about them. But after a little while, the rattlers were willing to say bad things about the eagles, and they just didn't like them. And there's no real difference between them whatsoever. That's a complicated example, but it is the case that when you're trying to communicate with somebody, I think the worst thing you can do is to say, you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat, and now the Republican and the Democrat are going to have a debate about this. The best thing you can do is to try to not put either of yourself under a label to where now you feel like you have to represent or defend somebody else, but you're able to just be yourself. And in that situation, you can maybe be more open to changing your mind than you would if you feel the pressure of your side resting on your shoulders. And part of what this looks like in social media is we have the worst arguments in social media when other people are watching. One of the reasons why Facebook is not a particularly useful medium for engaging in political disagreements is because the liberals aren't right, even when they're writing to convince the conservatives, part of what they're doing is they're writing to show the other liberals what a good, smart liberal they are, and how they really stuck it to that conservative who objected on their page, and vice versa. It becomes a sort of performance for our side rather than an attempt to convince and seek the truth with another person. And so you can deactivate some of those identities and get out of that sort of performative us versus them soldier mindset thinking just by taking it to the direct messages, talking to someone one-on-one, and framing the issue as hey, how can we work together to think about this, rather than what is your side doing about this, that puts people on the back heel.
Thank you. Next question. I see two up there in the back row. Some microphones up there.
Oh, and one there, yeah.
Oh, okay, we got one here.
Oh, it's fine, yeah.
No, there's one. We can take, we have three, yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
Thank you. I actually have to leave in a few minutes, so I just wanted to ask. So that actually brought in what my question was what do you do when you're sitting across the table from someone who wants to win at all costs? And wait, a side question is, based on what you just said, how do we convince people that maybe in politics to, how can I say this very carefully? To look at your points of view, for example, versus the us, them, the win at all costs, the, whatever it is. I know you're talking at a lower level, but we have to convince people that actually are in charge how to communicate. How do we do that?
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's a difficult one. I mean, so I think part of it is trying to, I talk in terms of games, in terms of, it's sort of like in a basketball coach will sometimes say, we're not gonna let them make us play their game, we're gonna make them play our game. And I think that's often the case in communicative encounters as well, of if it's in the who can be the loudest, who can be the firmest in their position, who can be the most dismissive and self-assured. That's a game that you're not gonna. It's really hard to transform that game into something productive. And there are some people that have years of training and experience playing that kind of game, and it's hard to get them to play any other sort of game. So once again, there's no trick solution. But I think sometimes there are ways of doing the unexpected. That's what I think is most useful, and that can take time. That can take reacting in curiosity rather than reacting in hostility. Trying to walk with them to understand where their conclusion is coming from, and then, as we were talking about earlier, try and figure out what work those beliefs do for them, whether it's social belonging, whether it's addressing a concern for safety or something like that, and then working with them to see the world a little bit differently. I mean, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said that it's not enough to convince someone of the truth, it's not enough to tell them the truth, you have to show them the path from error to truth. And in order to show someone the path from error to truth, you have to understand really well what kind of error they're stuck in. And so listening by itself is not going to solve the problem, but if you're in that position where you're talking with someone who just is not necessarily interested in hearing your own position, let them run out of time, basically, is probably what I would do. Respond with curiosity, try to understand things, and then from that position, try and help them get deeper than the slogans. Try and help them be... I think the best thing you can do in that encounter is not get someone from their position to your position, but get someone from a kind of automatic knee-jerk attachment to their position to having to reflect a little bit more on what they actually care about and why. And that can make a real difference in the long run if you can sort of plant that seed of curiosity and shift them into that mode a little bit more.
Thank you. The questions in the back, please, and then this gentleman.
Hi, I'm Julia Silva. I'm a senior at Notre Dame Academy, and just for that question you just responded to, what methods would you think are appropriate to kind of dissuade this person from the knee-jerk reaction, as you call it?
I mean, so I go back to that idea of resistance and respect, which is something that we're not necessarily accustomed to. In part because of a polarized society, we're accustomed to seeing either you're on my side and you already agree with me, or you're one of them and you probably hate me. And so the simple fact of existing as someone who wants to understand, learn from, convince, seek the truth together with, and that doesn't require abandoning all of your convictions and becoming this open-minded nothing. You can think that you know 90% of the truth and they know 10% of the truth and still have a very different kind of conversation than when you're both trying to prove that you know 100% of the truth. And so I think that idea of, in that moment, treating them the way you would want to be treated in a communicative encounter is a way of inviting them, again, to play a different game. You're saying, I mean, and you can even call that out explicitly. I think you can say something like, hey, you've had a bunch of arguments about this in the past. I've had a bunch of arguments about this in the past. Usually they just de-escalate. I mean, they usually just escalate and devolve and get worse. But I'm actually interested in, here's this issue, here's this problem, here's this need. What kind of world do you want us to live in, and how do you think we can address the problems that are needed to address to get that way? I think something like that. I mean, I talk about it in terms of disarming communication, of communication that puts them out of that customary mode and gets them into a different way of thinking. And there's lots of different attitudes or tricks that you can have for that. But the very fact of being curious and wanting to hear more while still maintaining that you disagree and that there are things you think they don't see can have a powerful effect.
Okay, I'd like to take that gentleman's question right there. Back row.
Hi, I'm Kirpal, and I'm a junior here at St. John's. And first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for coming here this evening and giving this talk. And my question centers around this metaphor from Aristotle that he used previously, which is rhetoric is like medicine.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, how do you recommend that you incorporate, different rhetorical sort of manners and different sort of rhetorical techniques in those sort of three forms of communication, like, civility, victory, and open-mindedness? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when it comes to rhetoric being like medicine, I mean, just as the skill of a doctor is rightfully diagnosing what is going on with the patient and rightfully knowing how to, sort of like I was just saying, get them from error to truth. You have to know where they're at, what concerns are motivating their position, how they see the world, such that the course of action that they want to pursue seems like a good idea to them. A lot of the work is done doing kind of tests, figuring out, listening, paying attention to oftentimes like subtle hints where you can see, oh, this is what's motivating your position. It's not that you're just stupid or that you're just malicious, you think that having this particular policy in place is actually going to lead to safety or something like that. Or you think that having this policy in place is going to be, in the long run, conducive to freedom. A lot of it's about learning to understand why people believe what they believe is a crucial part of helping persuade them to think differently. And what's cool about that is also the act of caring about why someone believes what they believe does that respect thing that I was talking about earlier. It shows that you're not so much interested in winning as interested in understanding. And it also invites them to be more reflective than they previously have been. Because they may not have thought explicitly about why it is they believe what they believe. So I think in terms of that metaphor of a doctor, I think it works helpfully in any time you're trying to undertake a persuasive encounter, is to think about meeting them where they're at, not necessarily in the interest of agreeing with them, but in the interest of figuring out, okay, what's this belief doing for you? Is there anything I can learn from this belief? And how can I untangle this problematic belief from a lot of like the really useful, meaningful, valid concerns? I do believe that like every belief we have is rooted in genuinely good concerns. We just go about meeting them in bad ways. I'm at a Catholic school. I can talk about St. Thomas Aquinas, who talked about all of evil is us trying to pursue a good thing in a disordered way. So you look at the 7 deadly sins, like sex is good, sleep is good, food is good, but what turns them to lust and sloth and gluttony, etc., is when we're pursuing a good thing, but in a way that actually does more harm to ourselves and more harm to others. And so I think in the interest of trying to persuade someone, trying to figure out like what good thing are they actually seeking, whether that's belonging, whether that's security, whether that's hope, and help them find a different way to address that concern that doesn't lead to the sorts of beliefs and practices that cause harm to others.
There's a gentleman here in the center who's had his hand up. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Alan, and Dr. Johnson, first, as the gentleman in the back said, thank you for being here. This is a pretty interesting talk. I'm really enjoying this. My question is, early in your talk, you mentioned that we were in polarized times. When have we ever not been in polarized times?
Sure. This is a great question. So in order to answer it, I'm going to have to nerd for a second. So there are at least 4 different ways that social scientists talk about polarization. So the first is elite polarization. And this is how the extent to which Congress, for instance, are able to work together to pass legislation versus the extent to which all of the Democrats vote with the Democrats and the Republicans vote with the Democrats. Republicans vote with the Republicans. And so in terms of elite polarization, we are at a higher level of elite polarization than we have been in the past. There used to be a lot more, 70 years ago, for instance, there would be a lot more voting where, the more of the rural states would vote together, and, there were what's called cross-cutting cleavages, where different alliances would form on different issues, rather than there being one big party block, and you're seen as a betrayer if you go over to the other side. So that's elite polarization, and it has gotten higher. There's also ideological polarization, and this is how different the average conservative is from the average Republican on actual policies. And we are more ideologically polarized, more different in our beliefs than we were 50, 60, 70 years ago, but not by that much. And that's part of what's kind of interesting, is because it brings us to the third kind of polarization, which is called affective polarization, affect in the sense of emotions. And we are at a high point in affective polarization in the last century or so. So for instance, let me see if I get this right. In 1960, if you asked people, would you be okay if your child married someone of the opposing political party, 5% of people said that they would have a problem with that. In 2010, 50% of people said that we have a problem with that. So this affective polarization has grown significantly in the last few decades. And what's interesting, again, is it's growing faster than the ideological polarization. So we dislike each other as political opponents more disproportionately to our actual disagreement. And part of that's because of the fourth kind of polarization, which is perceived polarization, which is how far apart people perceive the parties. And that, too, consistently, and at higher rates than in the past, Republicans think Democrats are farther away from them than they actually are, and vice versa. So in part because there are a bunch of reasons why we could talk about why that might be the case, and social media, for instance, the fact that we take political leaders to be expressive of their party's attitudes when people tend to be more moderate than their leaders, that sort of thing. But it is interesting in that we are at a high watermark of some kinds of polarization. I mean, clearly there was a civil war. So this is, we're not more divided than we ever have been. But it is at higher rates than it has been in the past. And part of it is the way people feel, because that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's part of what I'm worried about in the book, is when you think that there are two different kinds of people and that talking across lines of difference is useless, then you don't do it, and then it doesn't happen, and then there are two different kinds of people. It sort of feeds into itself. The way I define the difference between polarization and disagreement might be useful here. In a room of, let's say, we got 100 people here. In a room of 100 people who disagree, you'll hear 100 different opinions. In a room of 100 people who are polarized, you'll hear 2 different opinions. So part of the problem with polarization is it's not as if there are two kinds of people and they just have gotten further apart and like each other less. More and more we feel social pressure to identify with one group and to dislike the other group, to the point where in a recent poll, 77% of people said that the opposing party was a threat to American democracy. 77. And that number is going up. And again, it might be right in some cases, but it is interesting to think about how that change in affect and change in perception is also leading perhaps to changes in how we're being ruled.
Thank you for that. I would love to take more questions, but we're coming up to the 8 o'clock hour. And I know that the chair of the Shrewsbury Library Foundation, Mr. Mauboisvert, has a very important message to deliver to you. Thank you all for coming and for your wonderful participation.
Thanks, Louise. Russell, that was really great. Thank you very much. A little hand for Russell. He really came here with a lot of good information. Louise, thank you. I just want to take a quick moment to let you know that this Distinguished Speaker Series is supported by people like you. We looked for financial support from the community to run the Distinguished Speakers program. I did pass out to some of you a flyer on the foundation and what the foundation does in addition to the speakers program. There's a little QR code at the bottom. It's really cute. If you put your phone on it, it'll get you to donate to the foundation. So that's my job as chair of the Shrewsbury Public Libraries Foundation, is to get support to put on programs like we have here tonight. And I did want to tell you that on June 10th, we're going to have Dr. David McManus from UMass Medical Center, who is the chair and professor of the Richard Haydock Professor in Medicine. His discipline is cardiovascular medicine, but he is the expert on AI and healthcare. And his talk is going to be, can AI save American healthcare? Something many of you may want to come and hear about, because I think many of us are beginning to believe that the healthcare system's a little bit broken. I know in Massachusetts, the increase in healthcare costs last year alone was 8.3%, which is a pretty huge increase in healthcare costs. So you might want to come to that presentation. And in the fall, we have Geraldine Brooks, a New York Times best-selling author. She writes historical novels. She's absolutely fabulous. I read Caleb's Crossing that she wrote. It's really a terrific book. We want you to be thinking about the distinguished speakers that we have lined up. If you have any ideas or suggestions for speakers you think would be good for this series, please don't hesitate to let Priya, the director of the library, know, or certainly anybody on the staff will be willing to take those suggestions and bring them to the foundation. So thank you again for coming out tonight. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we hope you come to some of our future talks as well. Have a great evening, and thank you again, and thanks one more time for Russell.